thank you for that introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me today. I'm really looking forward to kind of sharing with you guys some of my research. It's good to see a couple of my former students among you, which is wonderful. So I am an English literature person, right? So I do a lot of research into literature, and I'm going to be sharing with you a little bit of my research, current research that I'm working on right now, that's working to kind of define and explore a subgenre of Pacific literature. And today I'm really going to be showing you the texts that I've chosen to talk to you about today are, hopefully you'll find them interesting and relevant. Okay, so children's literature in Oceania is really interesting, and the children's literature has been around for a long time. The stuff for young adults is a lot more recent. It's come out within the last maybe 20 years or so, and that's what I'm looking at, because most people either call it children's literature or just ignore it completely. And I think that's a mistake, because there are some really interesting and cool things that are happening in the young adult texts that are not happening in children's or adult texts. So in general, this is a little bit of information about children's literature. D.S. Long says, in children's literature, we see a growing number of books being written and sometimes published that are a result of an ongoing search for a written whangongo. Has anybody ever heard that word, whangongo? It's a Samoan word. Okay, so it's a type of storytelling that's told usually in the evening, time to go to bed, and so one of the adults will tell a story to all the kids, and they keep talking until everybody's sleeping. Okay, and it's kind of a mix of whatever stories the storyteller feels like telling that night. They can be traditional stories, they could be Western fairy tales, it could be true stories, whatever they want, and they'll kind of mix them all in, add songs here and there, but make them exciting, but not too exciting that the kids don't go to sleep, right? And so that's what a whangongo is, and what these children's literature books are trying to do is take that oral storytelling and kind of fit it into, and that kind of magical oral part of it, and fit it into these children's books. And so one of the cool things that happens is that a lot of it ends up being written in indigenous languages. Adult literature in the Pacific is almost always written in English or French, which are the languages of the kind of the colonizers. And so in children's literature, you get a lot more in indigenous languages, which is very cool. It's also a lot more focused on retelling traditional stories than you see in the adult literature. And it also highlights the importance of women writers. There are some, I think more recently we're getting a lot more women writers, but traditionally you have mostly men writing Pacific literature with the occasional woman, but now you have a lot more women, and a lot of them are showing up in writing for the younger sets. Okay. So the cool thing about children's literature and why it's really important and why we should care about it, because a lot of times people are like, oh, who cares about that? It's just for kids. It's kiddie lit. It's not a big deal, right? The reason for that is here. Okay, so Pacific Islands writers who write books for children not only speak for a readership now, they also create an audience for Pacific literature of tomorrow. A novelist may hope to change a reader's outlook, poets may want to place their hands on a reader's soul, but the authors of children's books do something more. They're also engaged in some profound sense in the very creation of readers. They teach each new generation of readers what makes a good story, and perhaps at some unconscious level, even what a story is. Okay. And when you're thinking about the context, the historical context of the Pacific, where you've had this really heavy presence of colonialism and westernization, when you have children's books that are coming in that are now teaching indigenous languages and stories, that's a really important project in kind of recovering lost language and cultural practices and things like that. Okay, so this is a quote from a Cherokee scholar named Thomas King, and he says, "The truth about stories is that that's all we are." I want you to think about that for just a second. The truth about stories is that that's all we are. And before we move on, I wanted to take a minute with you guys to kind of talk a little bit about the stories that are being told in society about Pacific young adults, Pacific youth. For those of you who are from the Pacific or from places where you have a lot of Pacific populations, California, the West, pretty much anywhere on the West Coast US, Utah, what are some of, or even you guys have lived here in Hawaii long enough, what are some of the stereotypes or things that you hear about Pacific youth and Pacific people? Yeah.
Very laid back and troublemakers.
Okay, laid back, maybe troublemakers. Okay, yeah.
I have a question. Would Pacific youth include people like in South America?
No, I'm thinking of like Pacific Islands people, so Polynesians, Micronesians, Melanesians. Yeah, that's a good question. Others? Yeah.
Big, bulky.
Big, bulky, yes. Okay. What else? Big hair. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Really good singers.
Okay, good singers and dancers, right? Get that a lot. Okay. In the U.S., a lot of times you'll hear, like, along with the troublemaker thing, like in gangs, being in gangs, right? And so a lot of these stories, we're talking about being big, that can either be associated with great, you're a football player, or you're a thug, right? It kind of goes either way, right? But either way, taking those either way, they're stereotypes, because that isn't really true of all Pacific peoples, right? So here's a few things. I just did a Google search, and these are the things that came up. So here we have barriers faced by Pacific Islander boys and men. Mental health and violence are the two categories that they give. Struggles continue for Pacifica youth. This is in New Zealand. Domestic violence in Samoa. Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders, challenges in education, healthcare, employment, housing. Cheap fatty meat blamed for Pacific diabetes epidemic. Okay, health issues. Okay. Yeah, spam, right? Pacific youth and violent offending, right? These are the things that they're being associated with in the media. Risk factors of suicide and depression, right? Gang tensions in Los Angeles, and then football, right? It's all about football. And in other places, it'll be about rugby, right? Okay. So unfortunately, these are sort of the narratives that are being circulated in popular media and culture, okay? And unfortunately, they often create kind of self-fulfilling prophecies, like, oh, well, if you think I'm a thug, I guess I am a thug, I'm gonna be a thug, right? And so that's where these books that I'm looking at are really interesting, and they're really important, because they change that narrative. They provide different representations of these youth, okay? So, and they're very rare, which this quote is going to kind of point to. So this is from a Hawaiian perspective, or within the context of Hawaiian literature. So a couple of words here. Olelo means language. Mo'olelo means story or history in Hawaiian, okay? So Brian Kawada says, the efforts to reinvigorate and recirculate our olelo and mo'olelo have mainly and justifiably been aimed at young children, though attempts have been made to address the needs of the older generations as well. Yet this two-pronged approach, dedicating our efforts towards our children and our parents, actually threatens to create another lost generation. There are no versions of our mo'olelo explicitly aimed at those in-between generations, especially if they're not already avid readers. And so he's pointing at this problem that we have all these picture books, and in Hawaii, and throughout the Pacific, picture books are really popular. There's tons of them. They're really great. And you have a lot of adult literature, but there's hardly anything for the teenagers. So they'll really enjoy all the picture books, and then they'll get to middle school and have nothing to read. Or the things that they're being asked to read in school are just completely outside of their understanding or their life experience, right? And so they get totally turned off to reading, and then you lose them, and they never actually end up reading any of the adult stuff later on, okay? So that's the problem that I'm seeing. But the cool thing is this quote was written in 2009. Since then, we now have some really good options that have come up for these youth. Okay, so I want to talk about 3 today. I'm just going to cover 3. And the reason I chose these particular 3 is that all 3 of these women are LDS, and I thought that would be kind of cool to point out for this particular audience, for you guys. So this first woman on the far left, her name is Lonnie Went Young, and she's kind of pioneered something that all 3 of these women have ended up doing. One of the reasons why there aren't that many of these books available is that getting published is hard, and particularly in the Pacific, especially she particularly has been told, she was told by like 20 something publishers, nobody wants to read about a Pacific Islander because the audience is too small. People are not going to buy the books. We're not going to take the risk, right, to publish you. So she decided, you know what, forget it, I'm going to self-publish. So she self-published her book. It became this kind of viral sensation, and throughout the Pacific, like I found out about it through multiple people on Facebook, okay? And so she wrote this trilogy. It's a young adult paranormal romance set in Samoa, okay, which is like totally new, nothing like it had ever come out. And it's really kind of a cool thing that, that she pioneered.
What was her name again?
Her name is Lonnie Went Young. There's a whole nother slide for her. You'll see it. Okay, and then you have Rangi Muleni, who actually attended BYU-Hawaii. She's Samoan, she is Maori and Tongan. And on the far left, you have Lehua Parker, who's Hawaiian. She went to BYU Provo, but she grew up here in Hawaii. Okay. So very cool, and all three of them ended up self-publishing their books, and they're all pretty popular as well among young readers. Okay, so here's this, I was talking about being self-published, and they promote themselves. So they actually help each other. They have these extensive blogs, and they go on blog tours and kind of promote their books with each other and for each other, and they've kind of created this kind of community that's really kind of a cool thing. And what they do is they blend in this YA novel, right? And all of you have probably read a YA novel, right? But they bring in Indigenous Pacific culture, language, practices, legends, myths, all of those things, and they kind of blend them together with into these YA novels, which is really kind of cool. And most of their characters are also Pacific Islander youth who are very different from the stereotypes that are circulating in the media. And so it's really kind of a really important thing that they're doing. So here's Lonnie Went Young. So we'll start with her. So she's born in Samoa, but her dad was a diplomat, and so she spent a lot of high school in Washington, D.C. in the U.S. She was a school teacher for many years, and then decided that she wanted to, she went back to school, got degrees in New Zealand, and then decided finally, I'm just going to start writing because there are no stories for me to give to my teenagers, my teenage students that I'm teaching. There's nothing for them other than kind of your canonical English literature that comes from like America or Britain. And so she decided to write what she thought her students would want to read. So she's very outspoken. Yes?
Is it in English or is it in Samoan?
It's in English. Yeah, it's in English. Oh, awesome. Great. She's awesome. Yep. So she wrote these things. And again, she was an English teacher, right? So it was important for her to write them in English. Okay, so here's the series. It's called Telesa, and there's 3 of them here. I think she wrote a 4th one that's from the boys' perspective. But the first 3, right, are about this girl who's half Samoan and half white from Washington, D.C., who knows nothing about her Samoan heritage and decides to move to Samoa to learn about it. Okay, and so it's kind of there's a love triangle, and there's like paranormal things happen. It's very much within that genre of young adult paranormal romance. But she puts it's all set in Samoa. You have all kinds of very cultural things happening within the whole kind of universe of there's kind of this magical power, right, that she learns that she has, and all the conflict that comes with it. But again, this particular series completely changed the landscape and created something that did not exist before this started. So here are some of the things that it talks about. It talks about Afakasi identity. So again, the main character, Layla, she's half white and half Samoan, and so Afakasi means mixed, right? She's mixed. And so trying to grapple with that in the States, she had a lot of issues with racism and people judging her. She goes to Samoa. She's very defensive that people are going to, make fun of her white side, but she ends up finding out that it's okay to be mixed. So there's a lot of those things that change these perspectives, right, that you get. There's a lot of culture that she learns, dancing, tatau or tattoo, the significance of that for Samoans, the cultural significance. She learns Samoan values of respect, love, obedience, family. And there's also a lot of in there, of course, right, she falls in love with the super hot rugby star, right, that's at the school. And she does a lot of judging as well, because there's this stereotype, right, the dumb jock that, like, you know, breaks all the girls' hearts and things like that. And he's totally not like that at all, right? It completely undermines that stereotype as well. But there's also this issue of, and I think this is where you see some of the LDS coming out, right? Is like, oh, well, should we have sex before getting married? And there's that whole sort of thing. And he's very like, no, we're not doing that. It's not appropriate. And so they talk about those sorts of things as well, which in a lot of YA fiction, you don't get that. Some of it can be pretty risque if you've read enough of it. Okay. It also brings up specific issues to Samoa that have to do with environmentalism, right? You have a lot of pollution and kind of corporate pollution, and later on you talk about some of the climate issues that are facing the region. And then there's also issues that have to do with culture, right? And some of the high rates of abuse that happen in Samoa. And she addresses those things in this series, which I think is really important for youth to realize that you can engage with these issues, right? As opposed to ignoring them or sweeping them under the rug. So in terms of the story, you have the kind of mystical power she gets comes from being what's called a tenesa, or a sacred woman. And these, in Samoan belief systems, they're very different from the way that she portrays them in the book, which I think is fine. But that's where she finds out she's one of them and she has these powers. But she has dreams, and you have all of these different things that happen in the book that are very culturally relevant. And again, you have every character in the book is kind of breaking stereotypes that are circulating about Samoans in particular for this book, okay? So I'm gonna move on because we are running out of time. So this is what she says. This is Lonnie Young. She says, Toni Morrison said, if the book you want to read has not yet been written, then you must write it. That captures why I wrote this series. Fantasy, magic, paranormal elements have always been my favorite kinds of fiction. I love the escape that they provide from reality. I love the possibilities that are inherent in them. I've always wanted to read a paranormal fantasy story set in Samoa, and there aren't any. In fact, there's not a lot of novels written by Samoans set in contemporary Samoa, and Telesa is the first Samoan young adult novel of its kind. And so she's really been driven even since this. She's continued to write. Since then, she's gotten really involved in some of the current issues that are facing Samoa, and she started a newspaper, an online newspaper. She just won a bunch of awards and was named Pacific Laureate for the region recently. So it's pretty, she's doing a lot of really good, important work, I think, for helping get these issues out and important, and our youth talking about them. Okay, so next one, I'm going to talk about Lehua Parker. She goes by Auntie Lehua Parker online. She's kind of created this persona. She was born and grew up in Maui. She graduated from Kamehameha schools, and she's what she calls herself an advocate of indigenous cultural narratives. And for her, it's really important to give voices to our Pacific youth instead of having other people defining them, that they can be able to define themselves. She lives in Utah. She went to BYU Provo, got married, and never left. I guess she still lives there. But she also has an extensive blog, and she self-published this series called The Niuhi Shark Saga, and it's based here in Hawaii, and it's about a young boy who finds out that he is actually part shark, and he can shapeshift from human to shark. And it starts out with I kind of did a huge spoiler because the whole first book he doesn't know that, but it's still worth reading. And it's really based in it's this identity, right? This kind of mixed identity. Am I human or what am I, right? He's also adopted, and so there's issues dealing with that. But again, you have a lot of these issues of fitting in, the importance of learning, right? This is a Hawaiian olelo no eau aohe pau ka'ike kahalau ho'okahi, which basically means not all knowledge is found in one place, right, or in one school. You have to go into multiple places to find the knowledge that you need. And so within the story, there are all of these different avenues that he goes into and explores to kind of find out who he is and how to fit in society. So he's an artist. His brother surfs. He learns how to practice lua. It's a Hawaiian indigenous art or martial art. But then he's also in the school system and trying to get into this prestigious prep school using his art. And so you have, again, cultural values, Hawaiian cultural values, respect, pono, or kind of making sure that things are balanced or good, love, family. You also face issues in here about language and cultural loss, which is a really big issue here in Hawaii. And so all of those things kind of get wrapped into this series. And a little bit later, it also talks a lot about environmental issues. He kind of uses his shape-shifting powers to like travel around the world and become this like environmental kind of, what's the word? Where he kind of just like becomes this environmental like guerrilla warfare, where he goes and like tries and fix throughout the world and tries to help with pollution issues, climate change issues, things like that. Yeah. So anyway, it's really cool. So you have in the story, right, these indigenous or Hawaiian kind of mythological elements of these shapeshifters and shark deities. You have Menehune, which are the little people of Hawaii. And it's dealing a lot, again, you have dreams that show up a lot. He has these vivid dreams. And you have what she's done, because this is more of a middle grade, what's called a middle grade novel, so that means it's more for like 12 to 14-year-olds, a little bit younger. She provides an index and all these kind of cool Hawaii terms and definitions to help them to really kind of learn and understand. She's really thinking about not only people or Hawaiian youth reading this, but also non-Hawaiians to kind of understand the culture more and kind of build respect for it, as opposed to just ignorance, right? She's really working hard for that. Okay, so this is what she says about this series. I write the Niuhi Shark Saga and other stories for island kids who never see themselves or their families in popular literature. So much about Hawaii has been rewritten by Hollywood, and that's tragic. There's a need for authentic Pacifica voices to tell our stories, and I hope to add to the conversation in my small way. When I talk with school kids, I tell them that we each have our own stories, and those stories are important. If we don't tell our stories, others will, and their false stories will become the truth for many. I tell them to be brave, to worry less about what others say you can't or can't do, and just go for it. Okay, so again, she's really invested in trying to help and empower Pacific youth. Okay. All right, and our last author, Rangi Moleni, she was born and raised in New Zealand. She came here to BYU-Hawaii and has lived in Tonga, Aotearoa, and also in the US. She currently lives in Utah. She's got a bunch of kids and like tons of grandkids, and they're mostly based in Utah, so she moved there to be with them. And she says that her writing integrates cultural conflict with romantic suspense. Okay. Unfortunately, there's only one of her trilogy, and I wonder, I actually have not talked to her, I need to, but I wonder if the reason why the other two have not been written yet is because she's been really focused on her family in the last few years. But I really hope that she does write the other two, particularly because there are several books or novels that have a Maori perspective, but this is the only one I know that's young adult that has a Tongan perspective, and I think that's really important, and I think that there should be more, and I really hope that she'll finish these other two books that are not done yet. But we'll talk about the first one briefly here. So this is a story about a girl who, very much like the author, is half Maori and half Tongan, and she actually, the story starts in Utah. And there are issues with her parents, and these are cultural issues that they're having issues with. So you have here, right, they're living in diaspora, they're living outside of the Pacific, they're living in Utah. The father has some kava abuse issues, there's domestic abuse issues, and also financial issues. And this happens a lot, right? That there are these cultural obligations that the family is asked to give money. And so in this family, there's all these issues between the mother saying, why do you keep giving our money away? And so anyway, so the parents end up separating for a little while. And so you have that sort of an issue, which is a really tough issue, right, for some of these kids, but it's real. And I think that's what's really good about this particular story, is that she doesn't try to hide these sorts of issues. She puts them right out there, that these are the issues that some of our Pacific youth are dealing with outside of the Pacific, okay? But what then happens is her dad comes back and says, okay, please give me one more chance. Let's go to Tonga for the summer, as a family, and let's see if we can work this out. Okay, so they decide to go, and that's one of the cool things about the story. Again, it's actually set in Tonga, which I think is wonderful. And she spends a lot of the time describing Tonga, but also, and more importantly, I think, the family system there. Okay, so a lot of youth, especially even Polynesian and Pacific youth that have lived outside of the islands, are very much just part of their own nuclear family, and they don't really understand the extended family system that most Pacific Islanders live in. And so it's very cool how her cousins come in and kind of teach her, and you learn along with her as the novel progresses, that there are all of these different values. They're explained and defined, and lived. Throughout the story, she finds out that she has, again, right, kind of these supernatural powers, and this is pretty standard for most of these novels, in the sense that they're bringing in the myths and legends from their culture traditions. And so she develops all of these different gifts that she has. Dreams, again, are really, really important in this book. And genealogy as well. She finds out that she's a descendant of Maui, the demigod, who we should all be kind of familiar with, at least a little bit, or at least heard of, since we have a version of Maui in Disney now. But anyway, I won't give you any more spoilers for this one, but it is really good. I'm dying for the next one to come out. But again, it does teach those and gives those cultural perspectives that I think are missing that you don't get anywhere else, and that these youth can't get anywhere else unless they actually go back to their home islands, right? And so it allows them to get that if they're not there. Okay, so this is what she says. My books flow from my Maori and Tongan cultures. They're full of intrigue, mystical elements, and clean romance. Again, I think that's her, the LDS coming out, right? Clean romance. As part of the Ngati Koata and Ngati Toa Maori peoples of Aotearoa, I have always been interested in tribal stories and legends. Integrating cultural conflict with romantic suspense is something I love to do. And I will say, for the romantic part, in the first book, it hasn't really developed, so I think that'll be coming a little bit more, the whole romantic suspense part. And this is a picture of her with some of her grandchildren. I believe they have kind of a performing group that they perform Maori cultural things in Utah. Okay, so I'm going to repeat this quote here at the end from Toni Morrison that Lani Went Young quoted earlier. If there's a book that you want to read but it hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. And I want, especially those of you who are from the Pacific, but those of you who aren't, I want you to think about, are there any stories that have not been told that particularly youth might benefit from, that you could tell, that would help them in some way? Okay, culturally, morally, ethically, whatever. Is there a story that you could tell, that you could write for them? Because the great thing about the publishing industry, as I've mentioned earlier today, is that anyone can publish something, and it can be really, really useful and helpful. Sometimes publishers don't always know best about what can be and should be published, okay? So as I close up here, this is kind of one of the arguments that I'm making when I'm talking about young adult literature for Pacific youth, is that I'm talking about, or I'm arguing that they're starting to give these youth representation, and it's positive representation as opposed to what the negative media spin is giving them. And that validates their identity, their self-esteem, their motivation to do more with their lives. And so some of the characteristics of these novels that I'm looking at is the way that they bring in traditional stories and storytelling forms, and make them relatable. It's really interesting. In the children's books that bring in kind of myths and legends, they kind of just retell it. They give it really pretty pictures and just retell the story, which is great. And the adult books, they'll usually use it metaphorically, right? So for example, they'll have the main character is like Maui, and the things that go through are similar to what Maui might have gone through, but they're very much like metaphorical. They're not really happening to them. In these young adult novels, they actually will say, okay, well, if we want to talk about Maui, let's put Maui right now into our world and see what happens. And they kind of create something completely new, which is really interesting and really cool. And I think that's really important, especially for youth, because it makes them literally look at their stories and their histories and their past and think about, hey, how do I relate to the stories of my heritage? And then you also get, again, like I was talking about, cultural values and an introduction. Of course, these books are not going to like teach you everything you need to know about your culture, but they can get you interested and wanting to learn more. And I think that's really important when we're talking about teenagers, because a lot of them don't have a huge attention span. And so having something that's really exciting and engaging then puts them on the path, right, to start wanting to learn more. And so that's kind of what I'm arguing. What I've done here, and I will share this this slideshow with Caleb and he can send it to you guys, but here are some additional titles that you might be interested in if you like the first three that I talked about. They're a mix of historical fiction. Some of them are, a couple of these two are graphic novels, or these three are graphic novels. Some are more realistic. This is set here in Hawaii. It's about a homeless teenager living in Ala Moana Beach Park and how he kind of copes as a Hawaiian being homeless. You have, there's a pretty good kind of mix of realistic narratives. Some are fantastical or magical and some are historical fiction. So hopefully you'll check some of these out. They do similar things to what I've been talking about for the others. And that's it. So if you guys have any questions.
Are you planning on writing anything?
Yes, but I have to finish my dissertation first. So that's the goal. So once I finish kind of evaluating and talking about all of these that are existing, then yes, I plan to start writing as well. I think it's really important, because there are so few of them, that more get written. So yes, they're online. And so if you have access to the internet, you can read them. And so that's one way that, especially something like the first series, Telesa, that I was talking about in Samoa, it got read because of that. Because it wasn't something that you had to either buy, because you can't afford to buy books, right? And then if it's not at the library, what do you do, right? And so that's one thing. Online, like something like Telesa is like $2 to buy the book online. And so that's one way, yeah. So you can publish it on Amazon. And what they do is they'll only charge you if somebody like buys the book. So you can do it two ways. So you can publish it only online, and that way it's like only a couple dollars. Or they'll print it on demand. If somebody wants a hard copy, if they order it, Amazon will just print it for you, and they take like a percentage. But it's very affordable. You don't need $1,000 or whatever to like pay a printer to print it for you. So yeah. So it's definitely doable. And the cool thing is, like, Lonnie Young has a lot of pointers on her blog. So since you're related to her, you could even just ask her. Yeah. But she's really good. And she's helped a lot of other people to publish their stuff because nobody has money, right, to fund it themselves. Yep.